the ancient priory, the year 1955. He laughed as he headed towards the ancient priory somewhere in Wiltshire, who dreamed of selling it and buying drinks for all his friends in his local pub. The priory had originally been built in the 15th century and had housed Augustine monks who made themselves wealthy at the expense of the local villagers. They ate well and drank well and lived in a fine building, while the villagers suffered from land seizures by these so-called holy men. When Henry VIII declared himself head of the church in 1536 and ransacked every monastery and nunnery in the land, the monks had suffered. Many had died when their fine buildings had been burnt down, and others of starvation. None of the villagers made any attempt to assist them. Memories were too long. Tony was only just 17 when he joined a local firm of estate agents. He was really chuffed. The bosses were entrusting him with the possible sale of such a large house, which had been converted in 1587 into a private dwelling. The house had been passed down through the generations and was now owned by a distant relative who lived in Australia. The man had only once visited his inheritance and decided it was far too much of him to take on the restoration of the ancient, tired building. So, without too much hesitation, he'd put the house on the market. The young man smiled to himself as he drove his own, albeit rather battered car, to meet possible buyers for the old building. He had only recently passed his test, and he felt very proud of the old banger, as his rugby-playing friends rudely called it. Tony had only been allowed to show a few tiny cottages or terraced houses so far. He was excited. His bosses thought so much of him. They were trusting him with such an important sale. His senior partners were quietly smiling to themselves. This might sort out the young man, who was rather too full of himself. The building had some terrifying tales of dark and frightening events. And, besides, none of the others had wanted to visit it. Let Tony go, they agreed, most of them secretly hoping he would have a scary experience. The young man drove through winding lanes and over down land and rolling hills to reach the property. He arrived first and was a bit taunted to find he couldn't drive up to the front of the house, because the main gate into the open parkland surrounding the house was rusted and locked shut with a large chain and padlock. However, a small side gate allowed him access. He stopped his car and left it facing the gate and sat there waiting for his clients to arrive. He couldn't wait to tell his mates about it at the pub that night. After about half an hour later, the husband and wife turned up. They got lost, they said. Tony was not surprised. The husband carefully turned their car round to face the direction for their next stop. They passed through the narrow entrance into the untidy grassy area. Tony and the married couple strolled up towards the front door. Tony had been told not to bother trying to open it, as it hadn't been opened for years. As he led them towards the side entrance, a flock of crows swept out of the surrounding trees and swooped down towards them. Not sure if they were merely surprised to see people, or whether they were in fact menacing. The three of them quickly entered the house. It was quite dark inside, but not dark enough for them to feel uncomfortable. Tony instinctively pressed the light switch. Nothing happened, of course, because the electricity had been off for many years. They made their way along a paneled passage, where it was obvious the woodworm had enjoyed house room for a long time. By now all three of them were beginning to feel anxious. The wife, Jane, got between Tony and her husband, whose arm she clung onto.
"I don't like it here, Geoffrey,"
she whispered to him.
"We are here now.
so we might as well see the rest of the house,"
replied her husband. They entered what would have been the main hall. High mullioned windows gave light into the room, but also created shadows, some of which appeared to move. Jane gave a little shriek when a piece of the ancient paneling crashed down from high up on the wall to almost hit their feet. Tony, who was equally fearful, decided he had to go on with the viewing. He talked loudly about the antiquity of the building, its history, and of the families who'd lived there over the centuries. They all heard a dog barking somewhere. Tony was surprised, as he understood the place was completely empty. As Jane and Tony passed through the hall, they both cried out at the same moment. "Did you see that?" Geoffrey quickly turned towards the direction they were looking. He caught a glimpse of an old brass fireguard, gently rocking backwards and forwards in front of a massive empty fireplace, big enough to have roasted a whole ox.
"Who did that?"
Jane whispered.
"It was probably just a gust of wind,"
replied her husband, but they knew it couldn't have been. Tony had heard rumors about the old house and its ghosts, but he had always dismissed them as fairy tales. Now he wasn't so sure. Maybe it had once an open space, without the guard, and the unseen servant had pushed against the heavy freestanding brass fire screen. He couldn't think of any other explanation. But there was nobody there, and he didn't say anything. Really frightened now, they moved into the next room. Floorboards creaked as they walked. A faraway door slammed shut above their heads. Unexplained noises seemed to increase. Tony opened another closed door, and was surprised to see what had obviously been the family chapel. What appeared to be an altar, with a large cross, greeted the three of them. As they stepped through the old ornately carved door, he was surprised that nobody in the office had mentioned the fact that house still retained the chapel. Was it his imagination, or did he hear the sound of chanting? Shaking his head, he began to think he was mad. Jane began to whisper she'd seen monks walking through the stone cloister outside the chapel. Her husband suggested it was just of old stone headstones in the ancient burial ground, which looked like the hunched shoulders of cowled figures. She could only say,
"Headstones don't move. What I saw were monks walking one behind the other."
She wasn't prepared to listen to reason. Tony had to agree. He was really spooked now. Tony was just about to ask if they would like to see any more, downstairs or upstairs, when a sudden flash of lightning and a huge crack of thunder cut through the silence. Jane really screamed this time, her fingers digging into Geoffrey's arm.
"Let's go. I can't stand any more. Please, Geoffrey, let's go now. Now."
In the instant flash of lightning, they had all seen a black menacing mass moving towards them. All three of them dashed to the entrance of the chapel, Geoffrey in his panic, while pulling Jane with him, almost slamming the door on Tony. Tony wrenched the door open and dragged it shut behind him. Now all of them were almost panting in their fear. The three of them rushed back down the paneled corridor, Geoffrey knocking over an old bucket left behind by former servants. It clattered to the floor, spilling the tatty mop across the stone flags, almost tripping Tony up. He swore but apologized quickly. Jane didn't even notice, in her haste to leave the terrifying old house. Geoffrey was really worried about her. Her breath was coming in great gasps, as though she was fighting to quell her terror. He wondered what he would do if she passed out. There was nobody around to help. As quickly as they could, they crossed the parkland to where the gate and their cars were parked. Geoffrey yanked open Jane's door and helped her stumble in, where she slumped back against the seat, still in shock. He got behind the driving wheel and immediately locked the doors from inside, as if to keep the evil spirits out. Tony had to shout through the closed window, mouthing in parrot fashion whether they would like to see any more. As if in answer, Jeffrey just drove away, not looking back. Tony returned to his car and climbed in. He too was sincerely shocked by the experiences. He needed to turn his car round for the drive back to the office, but he had to be careful, as the turning area wasn't big, and three-point turns were still fairly new to him. Deep water-filled streams lined the loose gravel drive. Stinging nettles and long thorny brambles crowded and almost covered the unkempt filthy drainage ditches. High overgrown spiky black thorn hedges left dark shadows on the smelly slow-running water. Tony backed his car up, but unfortunately one of his back wheels went just over the edge of the ditch. Swearing to himself, he got out to see how badly it was in. As he bent over, something picked him up off the ground and threw him into the ditch. Fighting mad and ready to punch whoever had done this, he scrambled out of the muddy water. There was no one on the drive, so he rushed through the little gate into the parkland. No one there, and nowhere for anyone to hide. Not a bush or a tree, nothing. Then Tony realized that when he and the couple had walked over the loose gravel, their footsteps had made crunching sounds. Whatever had come up behind him had been absolutely silent. Terrified that whatever it was must have been very strong to pick him up like that. He was a very fit rugby player. Tony jumped back into his car and drove himself out. Back at the office, the senior partner and his colleague looked at him, clothes dirty and his face ashen. Something bad must have happened, but they were not about to ask. Tony said nothing to them, or to his rugby buddies, that evening. One or two remarked it wasn't like him to be so quiet and subdued. It was years before he began to tell people about his ordeal, and I understand he never went within 10 miles of the ancient priory for the rest of his life.